Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia and today I want to talk about whether we are reading more classics while in lockdown and why that may be. This video was inspired by an article I read a few weeks ago in The Guardian, which was an interview with the author Penelope Lively. I'll link that interview in the description box so you can check it out for yourself. But essentially she talks about how people are possibly flocking to classics more than they did before this entire lockdown situation happened all over the world. And the article actually quotes some statistics from Penguin Classics showing how their sales, especially of ebooks and audiobooks, have gone up by quite a large amount in some cases for certain classics. And then the article kind of discusses why that may be. Now, I'm someone who reads a lot of classics anyway, as I'm sure you all know. I talk about classics quite regularly on this channel because I just enjoy them. And I have personally not noticed a rise in classics reading in my own personal reading life. I can't really speak from personal experience because my classics reading has very much stayed the same pre and post lockdown, but those statistics certainly speak for themselves. So I'm sure there is truth to that fact that people may be reading more classics now than they did a couple of months ago. But as I say that, I also need to point out that just because people are buying more classics doesn't necessarily mean they are reading more classics. And I can imagine one reason for the rise in classic sales being that people who maybe don't read many classics generally feel like a lockdown with the just drastic cut in opportunities for activities that they must be going through, that people maybe now use this change in circumstances to pick up a classic that they may not have read before. So I can imagine someone thinking, well, I can't go to work, I can't go outside, I can't go see my friends, I can't go to the pub, but I've always wanted to read War and Peace. And then they go and buy a copy of War and Peace on audiobook or an ebook. While I'm sure many people are picking up War and Peace at the moment, in fact, according to the Guardian article, ebook sales of War and Peace are up by 84% compared to pre-lockdown. We can't really tell how many people are actually going to read it. So why could people be drawn to classics at this particular point in time? I think, and all of this is a speculation because I have no points of reference here. I'm really just making this up as I go along. I'm sure a lot of people have this one classic or this one author that they've always wanted to read but never had the chance to, or felt like they never had the chance to, which obviously amounts to the same thing. Whereas now maybe another. Whereas now they might just have the time to actually pick up that classic, give that author a go and read it. I don't like how we as a society view classics, and I've spoken about this many times before. I don't think that we should put classics on a pedestal, that we should have classics right at the top of the literary food chain. You know what I mean. I have in the past passionately argued for just treating classics like any other book, like any other type of book, because classics in themselves aren't even a genre. As I'm sure you know, you can have a classic detective novel and you can have a classic romance novel and you can have a classic historical novel, and the only thing that makes them classics is that they're quite old books. I am not advocating for putting classics on pedestals, but obviously that's exactly what people do. So I can imagine a situation where someone's sitting at home and thinking, now is the time for me to tackle that book up there on top of the food chain. That metaphor doesn't really work. So that might be partly why people are drawn to classics at the moment. But I think another reason, and maybe this is just me projecting my own feelings onto other people, but I can imagine another reason being that classics are comforting in a way. Because a lot of classics are familiar to us even if we haven't read them. You don't have to have read Pride and Prejudice to know... Minerva. You don't have to have read Pride and Prejudice to know what it's about. Am I right, Minerva? Or you don't have to have seen Romeo and Juliet to know what it's about. I haven't seen it. I haven't read it. I could probably give you a rough summary of it. So classics are familiar, and the familiar is comforting when we are facing some really uncertain times in the world around us. The familiarity can also come from reading books that we read as children, reading books that we read in school, reading books maybe that our parents read to us, especially thinking now about children's classics and fairy tales. Maybe, as is often the case in my life, I see a classic that I should have read but didn't because I was the worst child and never read what I was told to read in school. And now I can take the opportunity to pick up that book again and give it another go. I did that very recently with Franz Kafka's The Trial, which I should have read in school but didn't. So I picked it up again right at the start of the lockdown, actually. And I can't say I found that book particularly comforting because it's weird, but it was something familiar nonetheless. It was something that I vaguely remember being taught in school, and now I could actually kind of relive the experience of going through that story and absorbing that knowledge that honestly should have been in my head for 15 years or so. Another big draw of classics could also be the escapism aspect. By their very nature, classics are old books. They are set in the past, they were written in the past, and maybe there is some weird twisted sense of nostalgia that makes us think, oh, you know, in the times of Charles Dickens, everything was better, which obviously wasn't the case because while you didn't have COVID back then, you had 100 other diseases that killed people aged 42. But it gives us maybe that warm hug, that sort of drawing us into the past, into a world that we perceive as simpler. And then I also think that a lot of people see classics as some form of self-challenge, self-improvement, learning a new skill type thing. We are all making sourdough, fermenting vegetables, learning to crochet. Maybe that's just me, but I'm not immune to the millennial bug that makes me try and learn new skills that I read about on Twitter. And maybe classics fall under that category. Maybe people who haven't even thought about classics before now consider it something new to learn, something to enrich their lives. And why not? As long as it gets people reading classics that I love, I am super happy about that. So if you feel seen from that video, if you're someone who is just picking up more classics now than you did before, you might want to check out a video I did a while ago, which is all about basically how to get into classics. I'll link it in the description box. I'm personally quite proud of that video. I think it expresses a lot of my own thoughts and feelings about classics and about starting to read classics and what that entails. So I'd be really happy if you go and check out that video if you have an interest in getting into classics. Let me know in the comments if you can identify with some of these things. As I said, I'm speaking purely theoretically because I myself have not been reading more classics than I do usually. So I have not felt that kind of itch to really read a lot of classics and dive into new territory there. But if you have, then let me know what your motivations are and what your feelings are about these kind of statistics that we're seeing about people just buying a lot more classics, especially in digital formats, than they did before. Right, that's all I have to say about this topic. I'm very curious to see what you've got to say, but for now I'll say thank you for watching. Bye!